Hello and welcome to today's Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research Training and Advanced Data Analytics webinar. I'm Elizabeth Chinexi, and on behalf of OBSSR, I would like to thank you for attending today's webinar. Before we begin, here are a few logistical announcements. Today's webinar is being recorded. All participants will be muted during the webinar. Questions and comments can be submitted via the Zoom chat feature. You can ask questions at any time. Go ahead and click on the chat, type your questions for everyone to see, and hit send, and we will monitor the questions in the chat for the Q&A portion of the webinar. So we have the delighted pleasure today to introduce a fun speaker for you. And to introduce our speaker today, I'm going to turn you to Sarah Curran, who's professor at University of Washington. Take it away, Sarah.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks to the entire OBSSR team for the start of the organization of this webinar, and super excited about the series. And I'm delighted today to welcome my own professor at my own university, Carl Bergstrom, who is going to be launching the webinar and doing so in a really profound and important way. Carl Bergstrom is a theoretical and evolutionary biologist, and as I said, a professor at the University of Washington. He's also an outspoken critic, if you follow him on Twitter, of low quality or misleading scientific research. His work concerns the flow of information, whether through biological networks or social networks. And he's worked on the ecology and evolution of all sorts of organisms, and particularly some around pathogenic organisms, including the development of resistance. He's the co-author of a college textbook on evolution called Evolution. And most recently, he and another one of my colleagues, Jevin West, have developed a course and a website called Calling Bullshit. His work has led him also to become a resource on explaining the dynamics of disinformation and misinformation generally. In addition to evolutionary biology, Dr. Bergstrom's interests include the ranking of scientific journals. He was profoundly important in introducing the ranking metric called eigenfactor. And this has led to him earning, along with his father, Ted Bergstrom, the Spark Innovator Award in 2007. Besides that, one of the ways in which I've grown to appreciate Dr. Bergstrom is his remarkable photographs of birds, which were the subject of his earlier research and has become a lifelong passion for observation and documentation, and just speaks to his deep and profound interest in all things human and planetary. And that's a wonderful way in which we can launch this webinar series. So thank you, Dr. Bergstrom, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That's a wonderful introduction. I think at least one of the birds creeps into the talk today in just in photographic form. So we'll catch that momentarily. Let me see if this screen share works. I hope everyone can see my screen. Somebody give me a shout if you can't, and we'll go ahead and get started. I want to talk today about the pitfalls of selection bias, because I think that this is sort of a fundamental issue in thinking about all sorts of statistics and all the kinds of problems that can arise when you try to use more or less any manner of data. And so it can be quite straight. What I'm going to talk today is, some of the sort of straightforward notions of selection bias, and then talk about some kind of more interesting extensions and things related to selection bias as well. One of the things that I do when I teach my class at the University of Washington, this is a class that we teach to students that don't necessarily have backgrounds in STEM. And we really stress the ways that you can see through misleading information without having to, dig into the detailed black box of the number of degrees of freedom in some kind of statistical test or something like that, but rather just by thinking clearly about the data that go into an analysis. And that's really the part of the problem I'm going to focus on today. So I'd like to start off with a sort of puzzle from the insurance industry, just to think about. So you've seen these for sure, whether you've watched the football games or just used the internet at any point in the last 10 years. You see these ads all the time about for auto insurance or home insurance or whatever. And for auto insurance, for example, over and over again, the companies will tell you that they'll save you, if you switch to Progressive, they'll save you about $500 on average, which must mean Progressive is a really good deal. Except if you switch to Allstate, they'll save you about $498. If you save to Farmers, switch to Farmers, they'll save you about $502. Switch to Geico, they'll save you about $500. This one's quite fun actually, because we have an email address for the Calling Bullshit course that we teach. And somehow that has gotten into the spam lists, and it has been parsed as there's a gentleman named Bullshit Course. And so Bull gets all kinds of spam, and here Bull could save $500 on insurance through Geico. So the question, of course, is how can every insurance company be about $500 cheaper than its competitors? And you can pause and think about that for a minute. One possibility is they're all lying, but I think that's extremely unlikely in this case. And it could be some kind of there could be some kind of technicality. I don't think it's even a technicality, but if we go back and we ask, what are they saying? They're saying customers who switched saved about $500. And what is going on here, of course, is that, you think, oh, I'm going to switch to Geico because I could save $500. Well, you're not necessarily going to save $500. It's that the customers who switched saved $500 by switching to Geico. And when you think about it, the customers who switched are not at all a random sample of all customers, insurance customers out there. The customers who switch to Geico are the ones that are particularly favored by Geico's actuarial algorithms. Similarly, if you think, the customers that switch to Farmers and so on, favored by those. In fact, you can actually find some of this information. It turns out about 1 in 3 people every year look into switching insurance companies for automobile insurance. And when they do, only about 1 in 3 of those, so about 1 in 9 overall, find that they can save enough money to make it worth making a switch. So what these ads are really telling you is not so much that Geico is a great deal or Farmers is a great deal or anything like that, but rather that people find switching insurance companies to be a pain, and and on average it's about a $500 pain, because otherwise people don't bother to do it. So that's kind of a nice example of these sorts of things in action. Now, I just wanted to, and we have this book that we've recently written about all of these issues called Calling Bullshit. Here's the book. And in the book, we introduce, there's a whole chapter about selection bias, and we introduce the chapter by talking about my own first encounter with selection bias. I'm a skier. My co-author in the book, Jevin West, is a skier. And, as those of you who are skiers know, some of the, most esteemed terrain and some of the best snow in the world is up Little Cottonwood Canyon in Utah, where you have Snowbird and Alta, two just, world-class resorts there. And when I grew up in Michigan, we'd skied on a hill that was literally made of trash. But once a year, we'd get to come out west and ski. And it was this wonderful thing. We'd go to Alta and Snowbird. But on the weekends, they get kind of crowded. And on the weekend, sometimes we would take an off day and run up to a little resort up Big Cottonwood Canyon that's much less of a destination resort, called Solitude. And Solitude is also a very, very nice resort, but it's not in any sense the sort of epic destination of it's exactly as these pictures show, essentially. And lovely terrain. I remember being up there about 15 years old. I had a great day skiing that day. It was a nice sunny day like this, and there was, at Solitude, there was still powder in the glades, hidden in the trees and things like that. And over the course of the day, talking to people, well, one thing I noticed was that, so many people who were skiing there actually thought that solitude was probably the best resort in Utah. So afterwards, I was sitting in the lodge. It probably looked very much like this at the time, eating a burger with my dad. And I said, hey, you know, I think we've underestimated solitude, because I had a great day. You know, there was lots of great power. The train's better than it's kind of, you know, it's harder and more interesting than it's reputed to be. And when I talk to people on the lift, you know, almost everybody said, yeah, solitude's even better than Alta. Like, wow, what a great hidden gem we've found. And my dad sort of laughed and he said, Carl, why do you think they're skiing here and not Alta? And, you know, that just clicked for me. It was like, oh, yeah, right. Like the people that I was asking, you know, of course, the people that are skiing at Solitude when they could be at Alta a few miles away are going to say Solitude's better. Otherwise, they'd be at Alta. And that's when it sort of, you know, this notion of selection bias first clicked in for me. And so it's this idea, right, fundamentally, is this, that when the people that you sample differ systematically from the population at large, this takes place when the people you're sampling differ from the population at large with respect to the particular question you're asking, right? So I can take if I want to ask people about their reading habits, perhaps I can safely, sample people with last names that start with B or something like that, because the sample differs systematically from the population, but not with respect to the question I'm asking, probably. But if I'm going to sample, if I ask people where they like to ski best, I probably shouldn't go to one particular resort and ask them there. And then the point is that selection bias can produce misleading estimates about populations. And so what I want to do today is just talk about some of the ways that this comes in, some subtle, some not so subtle, and then some related issues as well. Well, here's one kind of fun illustration. Suppose you wanted to try to get a sense of the state of marriage in America. One thing you could do is use so-called data exhaust, and go look at what people search for on Facebook and what people search for on Google, and what people post about on Facebook. And so if you go to Facebook and you type in "my husband is," you get this very, very rosy picture. My husband's my best friend, my life, awesome, my everything, the best, my love, et cetera, et cetera. And you think, wow, marriage is really strong institution in the United States. And you go to Google and you do the same thing, and you get a very, very different story. A couple of positive things here, but mostly negatives. And what's going on, of course, this is another form of selection bias. On Facebook, people are essentially trying to present themselves in a positive light. They're trying to tell a story about their lives, typically trying to tell a positive story. Whereas on Google, people often are looking for solutions to problems. Maybe, posting, they're not posting something, they're asking a question in some sense of anonymity and so on. And so you get a very, very different picture depending on where you look. And that's what I tell my students. Essentially, there's a lot of selection bias. You can kind of think of it as what you see depends on where you look. And this is a illustration of that. Here's a lovely little example of humorous example of a related phenomenon. So this guy says survival bias means this app will get fantastic reviews. So it's an app that supposedly will identify mushrooms for you with just a picture. And the point being, of course, if it fails, no one's going to be around no one for whom it fails will be around to leave reviews. Here's another example. This is from this summer. This is maybe the stupidest thing I've ever been quoted in a news story for explaining. There was a meme that was going around this summer that was suggesting, depending on which side it was coming from, that either the Proud Boys or Antifa were setting fires across the Western United States. And that's why we had such a bad fire season. And so you see a lot of these kinds of maps that were up there, very polite of the fires to stop conveniently right at the Canada border and the Mexico border. If the fires in Oregon, Washington are climate change, why do they stop at the border? And so these were the sorts of maps that were coming up. And so, of course, the reason that the fires stopped right at the border was because these were maps of U.S. wildfires. And so, as I was saying, this is the stupidest thing I was ever quoted for. Professors explain why U.S. wildfires don't stop at the border. It hardly takes a professor to see that that if you take a map of the United States, all the points of the fires in the United States, all the fires on it will be in the United States. And indeed, if, all I did there was just looked at the, maps of fires in Northwest, Southwest Canada, and in British Columbia and in Northwest Mexico. And indeed, they stretched right through. So those are, some kind of silly, basically sort of silly examples. But this has been really, really important. This issue of selection bias has been really, really important throughout the pandemic. It's been something we've been struggling with over and over as we try to make sense of data from the COVID pandemic. So one particular example was there was a story, there were some dentists who decided that based on the patients that they'd been seeing in April, that masks must have really severe health consequences, because the patients, and they were in New York City, and the patients that they were seeing in late April in New York City, had much more severe dental conditions than the patients that they'd been seeing in February. And from this, they concluded that something the patients had been doing over the last 2 months must be causing that. What had the patients been doing differently? Well, they said they must be wearing masks. And so it must be that masks are somehow, causing tooth damage, gum damage, et cetera. And they went and promoted this theory everywhere and so on. And if you think about this for a moment, you can see that what they're ignoring is the question of who goes to the dentist in New York City in the middle of a very bad pandemic. In February, before the pandemic starts, you go for your routine cavities and cleanings and everything else. In April, unless you're in severe pain and having really dramatic gum or tooth issues, you're not going to go to the dentist. You're going to put that off. And so, what had changed was not a consequence of individual patients, getting worse because they were wearing masks or anything like that, but the dentists were seeing an entirely different, or they're seeing only a subset of the previous population, namely the people that most desperately needed immediate dental care. And so this was a selection bias issue. One of the places where selection bias became a huge deal was in our efforts to understand how lethal COVID was early on. And so early on, one of the things we wanted to try to figure out, and it's very hard to know at the start of a pandemic, is what's the infection fatality rate? So the infection fatality rate is just, what is the probability that someone who catches the disease dies. So it's just deaths over cases. And often in a pandemic, we fairly quickly get a reasonable estimate of the number of deaths once people know what to look out for, and once we have a basic diagnostic test. So we figured, in general, we have a decent handle on the numerator, but we have very little. It can be very, very hard. Early in a pandemic, when you're not testing everyone in the population or anything like that, it's very, very hard to know the denominator, know how many total cases there have been, especially when you don't have a sense of, what fraction of the cases are serious. Do you have mild cases? Do you have asymptomatic cases, et cetera? And so it's very hard to estimate the infection fatality rate when you only know the number of deaths. And so what you have to do is somehow try to figure out a way to estimate the number of cases that there have been as well. And one of the sort of predominant ways of doing that has been, was to look at antibody testing, look at seroprevalence testing, how many people had antibodies to COVID. So again, I think it was in April. There was a press release that was put out by these two doctors in Bakersfield. They owned a series of urgent care clinics, and what they wanted to do was try to estimate the incidence of COVID. So what fraction of the people in California had COVID in March 2020, so that they could then know the denominator and then estimate what that infection fatality rate was. So what their approach was to test all of the patients who visited their urgent care facilities. Those were the patients they had access to anyway, right? And so they were going to test all of these. They found that at the time of testing, 340 of about 5,200 patients were positive, so 6.5%. And based on those numbers, if you plug this into a basic little mathematical model to try to estimate how many people, because some of the ones who came in would have already had it and would have tested negative because they'd already had it. And so you could try to estimate, well, what was the total incidence? And they said, well, we're estimating that the total incidence among these patients, and therefore in the state of California, is 12%. So that was at the end of March. There've been relatively few deaths in California at the end of March, and so this implied this extremely low infection fatality rate of about 0.03%. So on par with a regular seasonal influenza. The problem with this is, I think, fairly obvious, is that the patients coming to the urgent care clinic in the middle of a pandemic were not average. We're not a good random representative sample of all Californians. Rather, they were people who, in fact, these clinics were the only place in Bakersfield that you could get tested. And so, if you're in the middle of a pandemic, why are you going to go to urgent care? Either because you've been involved in some kind of traumatic accident or injury, or because you want to get a COVID test. And so you've very strongly enriched for COVID test for people who think they have COVID among that population. And so they sort of slammed into this selection bias problem. It didn't keep them from going around and doing the media cycle, and they became sort of Fox News darlings and this sort of thing for saying that COVID was all a hoax and it was less bad than the flu and all of that. But it was fundamentally selection bias operating there. Wasn't just so here's just an example. I compared this to what they were doing to try to estimate the average height of Americans by measuring the players on an NBA court, right? So it's not just a selection bias issue. It wasn't just a couple of doctors in Bakersfield that made this mistake. This was a very, very influential paper that was put out in early April from a team centered at Stanford and with collaborators in many places. And they were trying to do essentially the same thing. They were trying to do a seroprevalence study to understand the prevalence of, they're trying to understand the incidence of infection of COVID infection in Santa Clara County in California. And again, they ended up getting quite high numbers. There are a bunch of statistical issues with the paper. I won't talk about most of the statistical issues, but I want to talk about the selection bias issue they ran into. And it led to headlines like this. Remember, this is in April, right? So in April, we're saying up to 4% of Silicon Valley are already infected with coronavirus, according to the MIT Technology Review. So this was not Fox News. This was not Breitbart, but this was sort of accepted stuff, or at least getting a lot of press at the time. So the problem with the way that the study, or one of the problems with the way that the study was done, was that they recruited for the study on Facebook. So they just it's instead of sampling people at random, they this is again in early April when COVID was still not thought to be circulating all that heavily and so forth. They posted this thing, come in and we'll do take a finger stick blood sample, and then you can find out whether or not you have COVID antibodies. There's a little disclaimer about how it's not for personal health status, but then an email that they sent around, or that the spouse of one of the researchers sent around, it basically encouraged people to do this for personal health status. And so, why do this? Peace of mind. You'll know if you're immune. If you have antibodies against the virus, you're free from the danger of getting sick or spreading the virus. That's not true, but that was the claim here. So what this is doing is saying like, hey, if you think you might have had COVID, come find out whether or not you did, because then it'll be useful to you. And when you recruit that way, obviously you're enriching for the population of people who think they might have already had COVID. If you're pretty sure you haven't had it, then there's not a whole lot of reason to, then these kinds of appeals aren't very enticing, and you're not going to drive across town in a pandemic to go get a finger prick. Whereas if you think you've already had it and you want to know, or you think then maybe you don't have to worry about it in the future, then it's going to be much more enticing. And indeed, that was the sort of thing we saw, when people posted on social media about this. We got stories like this. Here was someone that came back from Costa Rica via Atlanta and lost sense of taste and smell, and then raced to sign up for this thing, and it filled up very, very fast. Within 10 minutes, it said to find out whether they had it, or someone else saying, I participated in the study because I was sick I'd been sick the week before, and so on. So that generated this sort of selection bias. Again, this study ended up coming out with this very, very low estimate of prevalence incidence that was on par, and that led to an infection fatality rate on par with influenza. And again, was picked up particularly by media outlets that wanted to downplay the severity of the crisis and so forth. So the point is these kinds of things are not necessarily beginner mistakes. And even among the studies that some of us who were less inclined to downplay COVID, even the ones we liked, ran into some of these problems as well. So one of the better studies run in April was a seroprevalence study run in New York City, where they sampled people at grocery stores. So there was not this, recruiting by Facebook or something like that. And this estimated, quite high fraction, probably not that far off, but that, 13.9% of New Yorkers had already had COVID. But even if you think about this sort of study, there are some problems. You can see how the selection bias could creep into a study like this. So you have, so first of all, you're sampling people at grocery stores. So you're not sampling any of the people that are sufficiently worried about the disease that they're staying home entirely. You're sampling the people that are healthy enough to be out and about, or sufficiently unworried to be out and about, and therefore are going to have higher exposures. And then you have to ask questions as well, and this just wasn't reported, about how that sampling was done in the grocery stores. Was there a line or not? Did people have to? Did you walk up to people and say, "Hey, can we do a finger stick?" Or did you have like a little booth somewhere, and then people had to stand in line for that in the middle of a grocery store in the middle of a pandemic? So again, it's very hard when you do these sorts of things not to end up enriching for what you're looking for, essentially. And so even in the well-done studies, this was a serious issue. So as one of the lessons for me, over the course of the COVID, the entire sort of COVID pandemic has been to really just be looking out for selection bias. Every single paper I read about COVID outcomes, every empirical paper, I'm looking very carefully. First thing I do almost is go to the methods section and look for what's obscured, right? Look for the possible sources of selection bias. And so, for example, you might have a study about heart pathology in children who've had COVID, and you see these news stories, and you say, COVID's worse than I thought, even among children. So many people, some fraction of people have various myocardial issues, and it sounds very scary. And then you read it, and then you realize that the study wasn't a random sample. They used children that had been to the hospital with COVID who had had cardiac imaging. And this is all of a sudden a very non-random sample of children, right? Even though there were children in the sample that had a range of symptoms and may have been in the hospital for non-COVID related reasons. If you have, you don't do cardiac imaging on children at random. And so anyway, with every single paper, I think it's very, very important to look for that and look for the part that you can't see, as well as the part that's sort of laid out explicitly. So that's been an important lesson. And then, one of the most important things that happened with selection bias and COVID actually involved our failure in the United States to pick up community transmission in the U.S. Anywhere near when it started. So here's a little graphic from the Wall Street Journal. On March 4th, California recorded its first day with 10 new COVID infections. But chances are the actual, sort of date when you first had at least 10 COVID infections was much, much earlier. More than 50-50 by late January, you were having 10 new infections every day. And in general, that was true over a large swath of the United States. By, mid to late February, many of the US states had a greater than 50% chance of having 10 infections per day. And so you can ask, well, how on earth did we manage to, so here's the sort of bar chart showing the timing for all these different states, and how on earth did we manage to miss that? And it's because of the testing criteria that we used and a selection bias issue that introduced. If you think back to February 2020, you may remember that to get tested for COVID, you needed to have you needed to meet one of two criteria. You needed to either have traveled recently to Wuhan, or you needed to have been exposed to a known US case. Actually, if you had traveled to China and had severe symptoms, that would also qualify you. But you either had to have had travel to China or exposure to a known US case. So under those testing criteria, they only found a handful of cases. These were in February. And this was, the strict testing criteria were driven by the limits on the number of tests available. Of course, there was that testing rollout problem that we faced then. So you had to meet those criteria, and only a handful of cases were found. The cases that were found didn't involve community transmission. And so people concluded, this thing isn't circulating in the US yet. The cases, we're seeing cases, but the cases are all coming in from China, or they're, people exposed to the cases we already know about. And that was sort of used as justification for the argument that this was not yet circulating freely in the US. But of course, you can see the circularity of this argument when you look at it, because this protocol guarantees that you're not going to find US cases. If you miss a single case, then all of the downstream cases from that you won't even test by default. And so you'll think, hey, look, I'm not seeing any domestic transmission of this disease, but what actually is happening is you're set up your sampling protocol so that you're guaranteed not to see domestic transmission of the disease. And because of that, we lost a month in responding to COVID. So I want to, sort of switch gears and talk about, some of the, so you can come up with designs to get around sampling bias. And this is a beautiful experimental design, I think, to get around a sampling bias problem that was put together by the University of Illinois. And so I'm going to switch gears away from COVID and tell you about what they were working on, and then about the design that they used. So this is thinking about employee wellness plans. A lot of you probably have employee wellness plans at your university or workplace. These are these things where you can sign up, and they have maybe various seminars and about wellness, and they have exercise programs and incentives. Maybe you get access to the gym, or you can do fun runs in the summer, or you can get points for your department for bicycling into work in February or something like that. So it turns out this has become a really big industry in the United States. About half the companies with over 50 employees offer these, $8 billion industry, and they're expensive. They cost over $500 per employee. And so there's this open question about, well, do they really work? The idea is, hopefully what are the employers going to be getting out of it? Well, the meta-analyses of these studies of employee wellness plans show that employees who participate have lower medical costs, and they miss fewer days of work. They also stay in their jobs for longer, and a few other things that employers would find desirable. So not only, is this better for the employees purportedly, but then it's better for the employers because it reduces the medical costs and reduces absenteeism. So, the idea is that this is, based on these meta-analyses, this would be a very good investment for an employer. The problem, and sort of an understood problem, is that there's a selection bias issue, which is that the employees who participate in these wellness programs are not a random sample of the employees at a firm or university or something like that. They may be the healthier people who are prone to do these kinds of activities anyway. And so how do we distinguish, but how do we, correct for or compensate for selection bias to figure out whether these programs are actually doing anything? And so there's a beautiful study that was done at the University of Illinois, rolled out at a university-wide scale. They divided the university in half, the university employee population in half at random. Half of the population were offered the opportunity to participate in the wellness program. Half were not offered the opportunity to participate. Of those who were offered the program, they were then given, they could then choose to participate or not, and that was then tracked. So you've got three groups essentially: those who were offered and chose, those who were not offered, or those who offered and chose not to, and then those who were not offered the program in the first place. And then you can look at what happens if you make the various comparisons. So the observational comparison that you would make if if you just compare among those who were offered the program, compare those who chose to participate with those who did not. And this is what typically all the previous meta-analyses had looked at, was this observational comparison here. Suggests, so if you make that comparison, you see that that individuals who choose to participate, are involved in more they do more running events, they visit the gym more, they're less likely to end their employment, their hospital costs are lower, their medical spending is lower. So all these desirable things happen. So that sort of confirms the, recreates the previous observational studies that had been done and that are incorporated in the meta-analyses. But they've also embedded in this, or this is embedded within a randomized controlled trial where some people are offered the program and some people are not offered the program. Now, if you compare the entire set that were offered the program, whether they chose to participate or not, against the entire set who are not offered the program, you get these estimates, effect size estimates here shown in green, all of which are very close to, and the confidence intervals include no effect whatsoever. So what this study does that's so nice is it shows it shows via a randomized control trial that there doesn't seem to be any substantial effect to these programs, and at the same time it shows that there's that these data are not so different from the data that people are using to reach the opposite conclusion, because they've embedded an observational comparison within this randomized control trial. So I wanted to just put that up there because I thought that was such a clever and creative piece of experimental design. Okay, there are a whole bunch of different interesting things that ways that things like selection bias come into play. One of the places we see it is in data censoring and truncation. And so I want to give you an example of musicians and mortality rate among musicians. Some of you remember Spinal Tap. So this was a study that came out and got a lot of press a few years ago, looking at the average age of death for people in different musical genres. And what the study purported to show was that the average age of death among people in genres such as punk, metal, rap, and hip hop was very, very low compared to the average age of death in other genres. This, of course, became a meme. This graph became a meme, went flying around on Twitter and everything. And we saw lots of these kinds of posts. Oh my God, gonna make my girl quit her metal band. Frown, frown, frown. Here's the author of the study talking to the Washington Post. People who go into rap music or hip hop or punk, they're in a much more occupational hazard profession compared to war. We don't lose half our army in a battle. And she's referring to the fact that the average age of death is half that for rap musicians as for people in some other genres. So it sounds really scary. It goes on to say, many musicians from younger, and then he then looks at causes of death as well. Musicians from younger genres appear unlikely to live long enough to acquire the illnesses of old and middle age. And so you can look at these various illnesses, and you see that rap and hip hop stars are likely to die, according to these data, of homicide, punk and metal, of accidents and suicide, whereas country is more likely to die of, say, heart disease. So maybe Billy Ray did indeed have an achy breaky heart. Seriously, what's going on here? Well, I think it helps to, if you haven't seen it already, it helps to look at an analogy. Imagine that you were to go and do a study of the lifespan of chameleons. Chameleons are notoriously short-lived, and so you could imagine getting an NSF grant to go study chameleon longevity and maybe look at conservation risks to chameleons in Madagascar, and to get a 5-year grant and go out to Madagascar and start tagging chameleons when they're born, and you track their lifespan. So you might see something like this. So the ones born in 2013, some die very quickly, others have long chameleon lives, which are only 2 to 3 years. And so there are your data. You do the same thing in 2014. You see some kind of similar patterns. You do the same thing in 2015. Now some of the chameleons actually are still alive when your grant runs out and your study ends. 2017, same thing. Your chameleons are now living beyond the duration of the grant. And so you're not able to go back and see how long they're actually going to survive. So what do? You think, well, that's kind of, we could just chop it off like this, right? And just use those ages. I mean, so that's clearly unfair because some of these chameleons lived substantially longer than that. You weren't there to observe it. So what can you do? Well, one thing you could do, you could just throw out those, you could throw out any of the chameleons that were still alive at the end of the study, right? You say, I don't want to bias my data. I'm going to throw out the chameleons that are still alive so that so that I don't underestimate the lifespans. But if you do that, you can see what happens now. Now you've set up this pattern where you have only very, very short lifespans for the chameleon individuals that were born from 2015 onward, because you've thrown out all the ones that didn't die early. And so from you might look at a pattern like this, and if you didn't know these data had been censored in that way, you might say, oh my gosh, something terrible happened in 2015. Between 2014 2015, that is dramatically impacting chameleon survival, even though these were actually drawn from the same distribution, right? So no real pattern there. So this is a sort of right censoring issue, and the point is, I think a lot of you can see the analogy. There's something very much like this going on with the music example. It's that when we go back and we look at the musicians, the older genres have people that have lived. Have many stars that were playing, playing jazz or country or whatever in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and people who were young and becoming stars at that time then have the opportunity to live long, full lives. If you take genres like metal, punk, rap, hip hop, those are much newer genres. People rarely sort of become stars in a new genre in their late middle ages or thereafter. So typically it's young people that are the stars. People who are stars, even the original generation of hip hop stars have not lived long enough yet to die of old age. And what this study is doing is it's just simply looking at how old were of the people in those genres who have died, how old were they when they died? So what this is actually doing is it's not saying at all that these genres are more dangerous. It's simply saying that people in those genres haven't yet been alive long enough to have lived, to have died of natural causes, and therefore the ones who have died have died of things like accidents, suicide, homicide, and so forth. So it's throwing out data ends up looking something like selection bias in that way. Give you another sort of very interesting one, very nice medical example. This is what's known as the Will Rogers effect, and it's sort of the consequence of changing group compositions on analyzing data. So this is named after this famous Will Rogers quip: when the Okies left Oklahoma and moved to California, they raised the average intelligence level in both states. And so, the joke, I guess, being that the dumbest Okies left and they were smarter than the Californians when they got there, right? That's how that could happen. So this turns out to have motivated a very influential paper on the analysis of diagnostic techniques and the effect of diagnostic techniques on cancer survival. So the sort of background for the paper was that there were these, massive improvements in diagnosis in cancer, allowing people to diagnose micrometastases, and therefore see when you had a transition to metastasis much earlier on. And because of this, and because of the sort of statistics around this, and the way that these techniques were associated with more survival, and not entirely. I mean, early detection. Then we came up with this mantra: early detection saves lives. And I don't want to say that this is wrong. People are correcting for things like the Will Rogers effect and so on. But I do want to illustrate the way that this could be misleading if one didn't think carefully about the way that the group compositions are changing. So let's look at an example of just where we think about a group of patients. We have a group of patients with localized cancers, a group of patients with metastatic cancers. Each bar here represents a single patient and shows the remaining years of life. And so, this is, say, with our 1970s diagnostic techniques, we can't pick up the micrometastases. And so we see, among the patients with localized cancers, got an average lifespan of 6 years. Among the patients with metastatic cancers, an average lifespan of 2 years. Now we develop early detection technologies that allow us to pick up the micrometastases in these later stage localized, previously localized patients. And so those patients get moved into the metastatic category. Now what happens? Well, now because we've included these patients, now the average lifespan in the metastatic cancer group increases from 2 years to 3 years. But something interesting happens because we've moved these patients who were the most advanced out of the localized group. The average lifespan in the localized group increases from 6 years to 7 years in this, I shouldn't say precancer, I should say localized group. So what we've seen is an average increase in the average survival of both groups. This is just like Will Rogers's increase in intelligence in both Oklahoma and in California. So what appears to have happened is, if you look at the metastatic group or the localized group, it appears that you have, by deploying this early detection technology, it appears that you've increased survival because members of both groups live longer than they did previously. And yet, as you can see, I haven't changed the bars. No one's living longer than they did before, right? So the average lifespan hasn't changed at all. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on, how can both groups improve, but the aggregate doesn't improve? Well, what's going on is that the sicker group, the group with more advanced cancer, it improves overall, but it also gets larger. The healthier group improves, but it gets smaller. And so as a result, if we just simply say, oh, both groups improve, then we get this misleading impression that we've increased survival when actually there's been no change whatsoever. So if we want to actually see an increased survival, what we want to do is we want to be sure that there's been an increased survival in the aggregate, not in each group independently, if the group compositions change, because again, we have a selection issue where we're sorting individuals into the groups according to their degree of sort of cancer progression. Here's another interesting one, Bergson's paradox. So I'll start with a little puzzle. So Google uses machine learning algorithms for choosing who to hire, and they've discovered that, or they did, and they discovered that this surprising thing that scoring well on a programming contest correlates with a negative job performance. And based on this, they hypothesized that contest winners are good, fast programmers, but it's better to be slow and careful on the job. And I think that's actually probably, turns out to be the wrong takeaway. And in order to show you why, I'm going to borrow an example from Jordan Ellenberg, mathematician's book, How Not to Be Wrong. And Jordan tries to talk about, why are hot guys jerks? I mean, there's this sort of, notion that people have that there's an inverse correlation between how nice people are and how attractive they are. And that may not be a reasonable assumption, but Jordan's going to show us why we might think that would be true. So imagine that there is no correlation. Here you've got I just generated a random scatter of people on the niceness and attractiveness scale. So let's suppose people are really drawn from that distribution. The thing is that no one wants to date an unattractive jerk. And so because of that, you wouldn't date any of the people down here in this lower quadrant. And simply by ruling these people out, that induces a negative correlation up in this upper quadrant. You can kind of see the correlation here. And in fact, you now have a row value of 0.26, negative 0.26, if you look at this group. So that's the sort of Jordan's point. I'll point out that, for most of us, not only are there people we wouldn't date, but there are also people who wouldn't date us. If you add that, and so this is one selection effect here, the people you wouldn't date. Here's the people that wouldn't date you. If you add that, then you generate a negative correlation of rho equals minus 0.75, where you get this strong negative correlation here precisely because of these kind of selection processes. So when you're selecting on these traits, you're generating a negative correlation among traits in the sample. Coming back to Google, ideally, if Google's hiring algorithm was working as they wanted, they would be using programming competition skills as an input into their hiring process. So you can imagine there's programming competition skills on this axis. Here's what really matters to be good on the job at Google. And they would use this as one of many inputs to hire the people who are best at what really matters. We would expect, of course, that programming competition skills in the population at large have to be positively correlated with what matters at Google, because you've got to be able to program. And a lot of people in the population either aren't very good at it, don't have the skills, whatever. So overall, we expect this positive correlation. Why does Google see a negative correlation? Most likely because they're overweighting the feature. They're overweighting this ability to program. And so they're thinking about a bunch of different assets that people bring. Might be their grades, might be their letters that they get from previous employers, who knows what it is. But if they overweight programming competition skills and treat that as overly important, then they're going to then they're going to hire too many people that score too highly in programming competition skills, not highly enough in other ways, and they will induce this negative correlation that they have observed between programming ability and on-the-job performance. And once you start thinking about these Bergstrom paradox issues, you see them everywhere. So you think about baseball. Why is it that the best pitchers and the best fielders tend to not be such good hitters? Well, some of it may be that they spend a lot of time working on their pitchers, particularly, focus on their pitching. But the people who are the best fielders, people can make it into the big leagues for being decent hitters and great fielders, or for being great hitters and decent fielders. No one makes it into the big leagues by being a bad hitter and a bad fielder. And so again, we're sort of cutting out the bottom half of that triangle. Why is it that some of the greatest songwriters have voices like Bob Dylan, and some of the greatest singers can't write songs at all? Well, there are plenty of people that have voices like Bob Dylan and can't write, but they don't ever get recording contracts. And so you'll see so many examples of Bergstrom's paradox once you start looking for it. I'm going to skip this next example, and I'm going to finish with a few notes about observation selection effects, because they're really, really cool. So one more little puzzle here. So in Portugal today, 60% of the families have only one child, but 60% of the children have siblings. And so some people may find this not surprising at all. Some people find it a puzzling riddle. How can this be? 60% of the families have only one child, but 60% of children have siblings. Well, we can just look at it. If you were to sample 20 families in Portugal, you'd see approximately this distribution of numbers of children. You'd see 12 families with a single child, 7 with 2, and 1 with 3. So you've got 12 out of 18 of the families have only one child. But if you look at the children, 12 of them are in single child families, 14 are in 2-child families, and 3 are in 1-child families. So you've got 17 out of 29 of the children having siblings. So what's happening here, of course, is that the children in the larger, we don't count, we count all the children in the larger families. So there are more observations in those larger groups. This comes into play in an interesting way when we think about college rankings. So one of the big issues in college rankings is what are the faculty resources, which basically means what's the student to faculty ratio in the college? How big are the classes? And it's very, very hard to actually get information about class sizes from universities, but Marquette University provides it, which is very good of them, at least to the nearest 10. And so here's some data for Marquette University classes. So they've got 100 classes, size 0 to 10, and 22 classes with more than 150 people, and various numbers in the interim, and so on. Their mean class size based on these data is about 26. So they could, advertise that their mean class is 26. But the thing is, it's like the children in the Portuguese families. From the students' perspective, there's 505 students in the 5-person classes, but there's 3,300 students in the 150 student classes, far more students in those big, big classes. So even though the average class is relatively small, the average student is in a big class. So in the average class size, as it gets reported, in this case is 26, but if you take the average student experience, take the average student is in a class of size 51 at any given time. And the former number, looks good. The latter number is almost certainly what's most relevant to students. And this is why so many of our students, will say like, oh, the University of Washington claims to have these small class sizes, but I've never taken a class that small. And it's not just bad luck or that the university is lying. It's this fundamental distinction. So if you stood out there on campus, in between classes, and you asked a random professor as they walked by, how big was your last class? The average would be about 26 because there's one professor per class. But if you asked a random student, the average would be about 51 because the bigger classes have more students. And so you sample those more times. Interesting for thinking about college statistics and so forth. It matters for COVID as well. We worry a lot about catching COVID on a flight. And we think about, where should we sit? And we look at the epidemiology of COVID transmissions on flights, and we try to figure out, which airlines have the least crowded airplanes. And so you can find tables of how crowded are the, what's the fraction occupancy of the airplanes and so on. But the problem is that airplanes are a lot like college classes. The average flight occupancy isn't very relevant. The average occupancy of a flight that you're likely to be on is the number you want. So most people, are going to be on the crowded planes, and that probably includes you. So what you really want to know for flying is the average expected occupancy of an airplane like that. And this is just another interesting way that selection bias or these kinds of selection bias-like effects can come in. I'm going to skip the friendship paradox and finish up with the take-home messages. So, of course, I've been talking about selection bias, which is what happens when the items you sample differ systematically from the population at large with respect to the question you're asking. If you ignore that, you get misleading estimates about the population. And it can take this wide range of forms. I've showed you just a few of them. And I think, both as a consumer of information and as a producer of research, these are really, really important issues to think carefully about how to avoid. So that's sort of my quick overview of what's going on with selection bias. And maybe we have time for a few questions, or maybe we should wrap up. Liz?
Yes, I think we have time for a couple of quick questions. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Carl. Sure. There was a question that one person posed and then someone else piggybacked on it. So maybe that would be a good one to take. And it has to do with the idea that journals and reviewers in theory are supposed to weed out studies with poor methodology. And so what's going wrong with our scientific journals, and why aren't biases such as selection bias being caught by reviewers? What are your thoughts?
Well, so there are a few issues. Some of the examples I showed from COVID hadn't been through peer review. Now, I definitely do not want to trash on the preprint system. That's been absolutely critical during COVID to accelerate the rate of scientific communication. And I think, we've really had big transformations in the way we do science because of COVID out of necessity. And that largely is for very good reason. And it's also true that these things get through peer review as well. Why do they get through peer review? Various reasons. I don't think we pay a lot of attention to selection bias. I don't think we talk about it a lot. I don't think we train our students to think about it. Jevin and I added this chapter to the book actually because of the peer review issue, was that this became the first thing we started to look at when we peer reviewed surprising results. And we'd say, well, let's look carefully at how this sample was done. As we found, and this is a large theme for the course, the problem was almost never that someone had misapplied the statistics it was almost always in these sort of conceptual issues of like, how was the sample chosen? And so I think the reason these things get through peer review is we're just not good at thinking about it. And we don't catch our own mistakes. We don't catch other people's mistakes. And it's just something we need to talk about more, which is, I guess, why we're here.
Right. And one related question was, what do you see as the difference between selection bias and generalizability of findings from a particular study?
Such a good question. Gosh, so Tagliarconi has this very nice paper about generalizability, or I think it's very nice. It's somewhat controversial. So I think they're fairly fundamentally different issues, though both extremely important. Trying to think how to like say anything in 1 minute useful about generalizability. I don't think I can. Read Tagliarconi's paper about generalizability. It's for me, it was eye-opening. I'm a fan. Make up your own mind.
That sounds great. There were a couple of questions about kind of lumping them together, but what would a well-done study for COVID do? And if we can't really do that perfect study, how do we rely on decisions? And kind of a similar question about researchers who are using novel ways of recruiting folks like MTurk and Qualtrics of the panel survey. So I think those are somewhat related in this sense that sometimes we don't have the perfect way of sampling and we need to make do. And are these studies just going to be vulnerable to sampling bias and there's nothing we can do about it?
Well, I think we're always going to be confronting sample bias and selection bias with Mechanical Turk and Qualtrics and things like that. I mean, one advantage of that is you sort of recruit the study participants before they know what the study is about. And so, whereas that was one of the really glaring failings of the Santa Clara study. So the hope with the New York study was that you were essentially, people didn't go to the grocery store to get tested, but still, who said yes actually probably did depend very much on what they thought, about their likelihood of testing positive and so on. So it wasn't a perfect study. So one of the things to do is to really separate recruiting from as many aspects of the question that you're asking as possible. Of course, you run into all these other problems with Mechanical Turk and things like that. I mean, I've seen studies that are basically asking questions about U.S. cultural conventions run on Mechanical Turk with no effort to filter out non-U.S. respondents. And then claiming that, people don't really understand these things, or so there are all kinds of problems that can arise with there. But in terms of a very, very quick answer for the nice thing about Qualtrics and things like that is that you do get the participants before you select the participants without them knowing what the study is about, and you get quite low dropout rates for most of these. That's something you have to watch. I mean, if you're, asking somebody to solve a hard math problem or something like that, and your dropout rate's 80%, you can't then conclude that most people are good at solving hard math problems. The alternative, right, is and I think we also, generally need to do is to acknowledge that you're never going to be able to completely eliminate these sampling biases and then to correct for them where possible. So, one thing you can sometimes think about doing within group comparisons. That was one thing that could have been done in the Santa Clara study. I asked people, have you had symptoms? Do you think you have COVID? Do you think you've had COVID? Couple of questions like that, and then compare among of the people who think they had COVID, this is what we got. Other people who don't think they had COVID, this is what we got. And we can't really completely believe that, we've got to understand of the people who don't think they had COVID, but still bothered to drive across town and get this test and sign up in 2 minutes on Facebook and whatever, aren't actually a random sample, but at least we have that comparison and we can start to try to tease these things apart. And I think, I'm not at all an expert in these kinds of design things, but I think there are people that could provide good feedback.
Well, thank you. I think this was a really fascinating and stimulating discussion. And I think your point about how the more we talk about this and the more we educate folks, then hopefully we'll change the reviewer pool, we'll change the students, we'll change the way people think about these questions as we move forward in our own research. And with that, I think we've run out of time. So I just want to remind everybody that we have recorded this and we will be posting it to our YouTube channel. We'll let you know when that is up and available. And our next TADA-BSSR webinar is scheduled for March 18th. So put that on your calendar and we will push out the topic and speakers on the website that you went to originally to register for this one, and we'll be archiving all of those as well. With that, once again, my great appreciation and thanks to Carl Bergstrom and Sarah Curran of UW for doing this wonderful webinar today, and I hope you all have an enjoyable afternoon.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate everyone's time. Thanks for joining us.